Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 9th of August 2022 of the New Delhi edition. The first article for today's analysis appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Launch a National Tribal Health Mission. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Polity and Governance, to be more specific under issues relating to development and management of social sector or services relating to health. See, today, that is August of 9, is being observed as the World Tribals Day. Accordingly, this particular article here discusses various healthcare challenges faced by the tribals in India and accordingly provides for a set of recommendations in order to bring about the tribal health revolution in India. So as far as the UPSC examination is concerned, one should be aware about various aspects of tribal health in India, that is its present status, challenges and strategies needed. Further, as you can see, in previous year mains, repeatedly questions have been asked with respect to various aspects of the public healthcare management. So based upon our discussion of this particular topic, you should be in a position to write an answer to this mains question for practice. The question here is, the health status of tribals continues to remain poor as compared to other social groups. In the light of this statement, discuss various strategies for bringing about the health revolution for the tribal population in India. See, as per census 2011, the total tribal population in India was around 104 million, accounting for 8.6% of India's population. As you know, these tribals face multifaceted challenges such as socio-economic disparities, poor social outcomes, poor health outcomes, and so on. For example, when you say socio-economic disparities, 40% of tribals, even today, they are living below poverty line. The all India average of people living below poverty line is around 22%. So undoubtedly the tribals face multifaceted problems, but this particular article here specifically focuses upon the healthcare challenges faced by the tribals. So let's look into these challenges one by one, starting with the triple burden of diseases. See, even today, the tribals face a much higher burden of malnutrition and communicable diseases as compared to other social groups. For example, communicable diseases such as malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, etc. is quite rampant among the tribals. This article highlights that even though the tribals account for 8.6% of India's population, more than 50% of the deaths due to malaria basically takes place among the tribals only. Secondly, because of changing lifestyle, environmental distress and other problems, there has been rise in non-communicable diseases among the tribals. So some of these non-communicable diseases include cancer, hypertension, diabetes, etc. And more often than not, the tribals as such are not even aware that they might be suffering from these non-communicable diseases. And the third burden is with respect to the growing instances of mental illness among the tribals, accompanied by growing addiction to tobacco as well as alcohol. The second one is with respect to poor healthcare infrastructure. See, the tribals as such, they are dependent upon the public healthcare infrastructure such as the primary healthcare centers which we are set up in rural India. But since these tribals live in geographically isolated areas, we do not have adequate number of primary healthcare centers to take care of the healthcare needs of these tribals. This article highlights that we can see a shortage of almost around 27 to 40% in the number of such primary healthcare facilities, which in turn is making the access to healthcare unaffordable for the tribals. Nextly, see, not only are we facing a shortage of healthcare infrastructure, We also are facing an acute shortage of healthcare resources such as doctors, nurses, etc. So usually the doctors and nurses are reluctant to work in the tribal areas due to poor working conditions, language barrier, limited social infrastructure, and so on. Some of the states in case of India have introduced the compulsory rural service for the doctors. However, this particular initiative has not been very successful. The next problem is with respect to the attitude of the tribals towards the public health. For example, most of the tribals do not have adequate trust in modern scientific knowledge. So most of the tribals as such approach the traditional healers even when they suffer from serious illness such as cancer, HIV, and so on. Secondly, the tribals are also not aware of the Indian traditional medicines, that is Ayush, and this especially is a problem in the northeastern states of India. And lastly, the tribals as such do not have proper awareness about the causes of diseases, and hence they do not place adequate amount of emphasis on sanitation, personal hygiene, nutrition, and immunization. So the overall immunization coverage among the tribals is quite poor, either due to poor awareness or due to their socio-religious outlook. The next problem is with respect to lack of adequate financial allocation. See, presently if you see the combined expenditure of both center and states on health, it is hardly around 1.5% of India's GDP. This roughly translates into rupees 3 per person per day. So we are significantly underspending on health, and this is much below the target of 2.5% as set under the National Health Policy 2017. Smaller economies such as Bhutan and Sri Lanka, they are spending much higher than what we are spending on public health. For example, in Bhutan, it is 2.5%, and in case of Sri Lanka, it is 1.6%. So this 1.5% is what we are spending on the overall public health in India. But with respect to how much money are we actually spending on tribal health, we do not have adequate data on this. Similarly, the Expert Committee on Tribal Health, which submitted its recommendations in the year 2018, also highlighted that we have not given adequate amount of focus to collect data related to tribal health. So this committee highlighted that we do not have data related to tribal health such as life expectancy, infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, and so on. So this particular expert committee took support of the data from the Lancet study. So according to this particular committee, the life expectancy among the tribals is much lower at 64 in comparison to all India average. This committee also highlighted that even this life expectancy of 64 could actually be much lower, since most of the time the child deaths in the tribals do not get reported. Secondly, the malnutrition among the adolescent girls is much higher, wherein almost around 50% of the adolescent girls are malnourished. With respect to institutional deliveries, this expert committee pointed out that even today 27% of the tribal women deliver at home instead of delivering at the hospitals. So the poor coverage of institutional deliveries is due to language barrier, due to lack of trust in the rural healthcare infrastructure, and so on. And last and most importantly, this expert committee on tribal health also pointed out that the infant mortality rate in the tribals is one of the highest in the world. In fact, it is second only to Pakistan. So having discussed about the present challenges faced by the tribals with respect to healthcare, let us now look into the recommendations of the expert committee on tribal health. So this particular committee highlighted that since India's independence, we always knew that the tribals in case of India face various healthcare challenges. But we did not give any kind of explicit focus on improving their healthcare needs. We did not provide that kind of explicit focus because we always thought that whatever are the healthcare needs of the tribals, whatever are the healthcare problems of the tribals, these needs and problems are similar to the needs and problems of other social groups. So what we did was we adopted a kind of one size fits all approach to address the healthcare needs of the tribals without realizing the fact that the tribals as such, they have their own healthcare problems, they have their own healthcare needs, and these needs and problems are completely different from, say, other social groups. So if we have to improve the health status of the tribals, we need to give a explicit focus on the tribal healthcare. We need to realize that the tribals have their own special needs, own special problems, and these special needs and problems cannot be solved through one size fits all approach. Rather, it has to be solved only through a targeted approach towards improving the health outcomes of the tribals. So let's look into these recommendations one by one, starting with the need to set up the National Tribal Health Council. So the committee has suggested that we need to set up a National Tribal Health Council. This health council as such should comprise of the representative from various ministries such as the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, Ministry of Rural Development, and so on. So all the relevant stakeholders should be given due representation in the Tribal Health Council. And this Tribal Health Council as such should be able to design and approve policies to improve the tribal health. It should try to develop various institutions to improve the tribal health. This Tribal Health Council should also ensure that we have adequate human resources to take care of the healthcare needs of the tribals. Secondly, see, the National Tribal Health Council should actually design policies for the tribal health. But once these policies are designed, we need to have the Tribal Health Directorate to implement this policy. So the National Tribal Health Council can set up broad targets with respect to the tribal health outcomes. For example, the targets could be set with respect to how we can reduce the IMR, how we can reduce the MMR, how we can improve the life expectancy at birth, and so on. So accordingly, once these targets are laid down by the National Tribal Health Council, it shall be the responsibility of the Tribal Health Directorate to implement these policies to achieve the targets. Apart from that, as I said earlier, the Expert Committee on Tribal Health had pointed out that we do not have adequate data related to tribal health. Accordingly, the Tribal Health Directorate should publish State of Tribal Health Report every year, and this particular report should be placed before the Indian Parliament. Similarly, most of you must be aware about the Niti Aayog's Sustainable Development Index. The Sustainable Development Index basically compares the performance of different states with respect to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So the SDG Index as such fosters a spirit of competitive federalism among the states, wherein different states compete with each other with respect to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. On similar lines, we need to publish the Tribal Health Index in order to foster the competitive federalism among the states in order to improve the tribal health outcomes. Nextly, in order to efficiently implement the policies at the district level, we need to have the tribal health officers. These tribal health officers should be posted in the districts where more than 50% of the population is the scheduled tribes. So these tribal health officers should coordinate with the Gram Sabhas to formulate the district level health plans. Nextly, see, the Expert Committee on Tribal Health has also pointed out that there is lack of community participation for the delivery of healthcare services in the tribal areas. See, we must realize that if we have to solve the problems faced by the tribals, we need to engage the community, and this community as such should be engaged in formulation of policies and implementation of such policies. Accordingly, the Expert Committee on Tribal Health has suggested that the Gram Sabha in the tribal areas should be adequately empowered to conduct what is referred to as the tribal health assemblies. So in such tribal health assemblies, all the members of Gram Sabha should come together they should discuss their healthcare needs and accordingly formulate a plan. And these tribal healthcare assemblies should be organized on a regular basis. So this will give a sense of ownership over the management of health among the tribals. And more importantly, it will help us to meet the specific needs and demands of the tribal groups. And nextly, we must have a national tribal health action plan with clear-cut targets and timelines. So under this particular action plan, our target should be to ensure that the health outcomes among the tribals reaches on par with the other social groups in the next 10 years. The next one is with respect to adequate financial allocation. See, like I said, right now we do not know as to how much money are we actually spending on the tribal health. So going forward, we must ensure that since tribals account for 8.6% of India's population, at least 8.6% of our healthcare budget should be spent on tribals alone. Nextly, see, right now in case of rural India, we have set up the primary healthcare centers, but these primary healthcare centers are facing multiple problems. For example, the primary healthcare centers predominantly focus upon children and women, and hence they may not be able to address the specific problems and needs of the tribals. Similarly, the primary healthcare centers focus more upon prevention of illness rather than promotion of wellness. For example, the primary healthcare centers have not given adequate amount of focus on promoting good health among the people. The primary healthcare centers also do not provide for the diagnostic services or for providing free medicines to the people and so on. Accordingly, right now, under the Ayushman Bharat scheme, we are upgrading 1.5 lakh primary healthcare centers into health and wellness centers. So right now we are already doing this. But going forward, we have to specially create the tribal health and wellness centers to specifically cater to the tribal population. So in the tribal districts, in the tribal blocks, these health and wellness centers should be rather renamed as the tribal health and wellness centers, and these centers should focus on preventive, promotive, curative and rehabilitative services. Nextly, as you know, presently we are implementing the Ayushman Bharat scheme in order to provide for the health insurance cover of up to rupees 5 lakh to certain identified families. So this 5 lakh insurance cover is provided for both secondary treatment as well as a tertiary treatment. So we have to extend this health insurance cover to as many tribal families as possible. Nextly, we need to empower the community at the grassroots. For example, massive health literacy drive should be conducted through mass media, folk media, schools, etc. And this literacy drive as such should be specifically conducted in the local tribal dialects and by using the local cultural symbols so that it has a maximum impact on the attitude of the tribals towards their health. Similarly, we can train certain tribal youths as Arogya Mitras in order to spread awareness about the good health practices. Nextly, periodic diagnostic and surgical camps must be organized in the tribal blocks. So the specialist doctors deployed at the district level hospitals and the medical colleges should visit these tribal blocks on a regular basis and conduct the diagnostic and surgical camps. And last and most importantly, we can explore the public-private partnership for providing healthcare needs to the tribal population. So such kind of public-private partnership can be made with certain NGOs or with companies which would want to contribute to the healthcare management due to their corporate social responsibilities. So these are some of the important things which one should know as far as this particular article is concerned. So based upon a discussion, please try to write an answer to the mains question for practice given here. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 14. Now this particular article highlights that recently Finance Minister has made a statement in which she has highlighted that infrastructure worth 1.62 lakh crores would be monetized in the financial year 22-23. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims, under the subsection of Indian economy. As far as this article is concerned, one should be aware about the concept of monetization of assets, in particular, the important concept of national monetization pipeline and how is it different from the National Land Monetization Corporation. So, based upon our discussion of this particular topic, you should be in a position to attempt these three prelims questions for practice. So, let us get into the discussion of the monetization of assets. See, the government of India has come up with a very grand and ambitious plan which is referred to as National Infrastructure Pipeline. Under the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the government of India seeks to spend 111 lakh crore over the next 5 years for creating world-class infrastructure. So this National Infrastructure Pipeline is going to be funded by center, state, as well as the private sector. The question is, from where will the central government get its share of funding for the National Infrastructure Pipeline? Out of different sources of funding, two main sources of funding for the central government for the National Infrastructure Pipeline would be one, monetization of core assets, and second one is monetization of non-core assets. So what do you exactly mean by monetization of assets? Now let's say you have a particular PSU or a government agency. This PSU may own certain core assets. Now core assets may be those assets which are integral to the functioning of a PSU. And non-core assets are the surplus land and the building which a particular PSU or a government agency may own. To distinguish this particular difference between core and non-core assets, let's consider an example of National Highway Authority of India. Now this National Highway Authority of India may have already constructed the national highways, and these national highways might be maintained by NHAI presently. So this already constructed national highways can be considered to be the core assets for National Highway Authority of India. On the other hand, the surplus land, the surplus building which the National Highway Authority of India owns, it may be considered to be a non-core asset. For example, the National Highway Authority of India may own a building in a prime locality in the city of Mumbai or Delhi. So this building as such can be considered to be a non-core asset. It is a non-core asset because it is not integral to the functioning of NHAI. Similarly, if you look at Ministry of Railways, the Ministry of Railways has laid on railway tracks, it has constructed the railway stations, it has set up the railway signaling system. So these railway stations, railway tracks, railway signaling as such can be considered to its core assets because they are integral to its functioning. But the surplus land, the surplus building which the Department of Railways own, it can be considered to be the non-core assets. So what do you actually mean by monetization of core assets? Now, like I said, different government agencies and departments have already built infrastructure which can include roads, ports, airports, telecom towers, stadiums, and so on. So these are infrastructure which is already built. And since it is already built, the government may be spending huge amount of money on maintenance of these assets. Apart from that, these assets as such may be significantly underutilized, which means they may not be utilized to the optimum level. So as part of monetization of core assets, what we are going to do here is we are going to identify such assets which are significantly underutilized, where the government is spending huge amount of money. So once these assets are identified, these assets will be then leased out to the private sector for next 25 to 30 years. So when they are leased out to the private sector for the next 25 to 30 years, the private sector as such will be required to pay certain upfront money directly to the government of India. So this upfront money which the government is going to get, that money we are going to in turn use it to create new infrastructure projects. Now, for example, let's say you have a already built national highway. So this already built national highway will be identified. Then it will be transferred to the private sector or leased to the private sector for next 25 to 30 years, for which the private sector will immediately pay certain amount of money to the government, and the government will then use this particular money to build new national highways. Apart from that, since this private sector has leased in the national highway for next 25 to 30 years, the private sector will erect the toll. By erecting the toll, it will collect the toll free from the vehicles which will be using this particular national highway, and this toll will then be used by the private sector for the maintenance of national highway as well as for recovering whatever money the private sector has paid to the government of India. So, if you look at the benefits as far as the government is concerned, the government is no longer involved in maintenance of assets. The government will be able to ensure that the assets are more efficiently utilized. More importantly, government will get some upfront money which then can be used for creating new infrastructure projects. So this aspect of monetization of core assets is itself referred to as national monetization pipeline. So under this national monetization pipeline, the government has sought to raise almost around rupees 6 lakh crores over the next 4 years. So national monetization pipeline is in co-terminus with national infrastructure pipeline. So out of rupees 111 lakh crore, which is to be spent under NIP, 6 lakh crores would be raised through the national monetization pipeline. But there are some things that you must understand about national monetization pipeline. The first thing here is it does not include the monetization of the non-core assets, that is land and buildings. So the monetization of non-core assets, that is land and buildings, is altogether different, and it is part of the National Land Monetization Corporation. Secondly, you must also understand that the national monetization pipeline, it is not privatization. Why it is not privatization? Because here we are not selling the assets. We are not selling roads. We are not selling airports, ports, telecom towers. We are just leasing out these already created infrastructure to the private sector for say next 20 to 25 years. That is why it is not privatization. And third and most importantly, the national monetization pipeline can simply be considered to be a form of public-private partnership, since here the private sector is involved in the maintenance of already created infrastructure projects. So this national monetization pipeline, it is actually prepared by Niti Aayog. Secondly, when you look at the monetization of non-core assets, that is land and buildings, to undertake monetization of non-core assets, we have set up a new agency known as National Land Monetization Corporation. So right now it has been estimated that different government ministries and departments may have around more than 5 lakh hectares of surplus land, which right now may not be utilized. So what we are going to do here is whatever surplus land, surplus building, different ministries and departments have, these surplus land and buildings are going to be identified, and after we identify this surplus land and building, all of this land and buildings will be pooled in, and this surplus land and building will be transferred to National Land Monetization Corporation, and this National Land Monetization Corporation would have necessary professional expertise in order to carry out the monetization of these non-core assets. But please do remember here, when we say monetization of non-core assets, here it can include either the sale or the lease of non-core assets. So either we may sell off or lease out the land and the buildings. But when we say monetization of core assets, here we are not going to sell off the core assets. Here we are just going to lease out the core assets. So the sale or leasing out of the non-core assets would be the responsibility of National Land Monetization Corporation. Apart from that, the National Land Monetization Corporation will also help different government ministries and departments to identify their non-core assets And third and most importantly, it will also act as a repository of best practices with respect to the monetization of non-core assets. This National Land Monetization Corporation would function under the Department of Public Enterprises under the Ministry of Finance. Now, with respect to monetization of core assets as well as monetization of non-core assets, you must understand that India is not a first country to try out the monetization of assets. For example, with respect to monetization of core assets, it was initially tried out in other countries such as Australia, wherein in Australia it was referred to as the Asset Recycling Initiative. Similarly, in Indonesia, this such an exercise was referred to as Limited Concession Scheme. With respect to monetization of non-core assets, one of the most important case study is from that of Canada. So in Canada, the Canada government had set up a separate agency to undertake monetization of the non-core assets, and this particular agency is considered to be extremely successful since it has been able to generate huge amount of profits, and every year this particular agency pays huge amount of dividend to the Canada government. So these are some of the important things which you must understand as far as monetization of assets is concerned. So based upon a discussion, please have a look at these three practice questions and let me know the answer in the comment section given below. To know the right answer to each of these questions, please go to the end of the video in which I have shared the right answers to each of these questions. The next article appears on page number 3. The article is titled as Kerala Governor objects to the reissuance of ordinances. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 2 Polity and Governance, more specifically under the subsection of separation of powers. Now, before discussing this article in much greater detail, let us first look into the background. I hope all of you must be knowing that we have three different organs, that is legislature, executive and judiciary. And as per the separation of powers, each of these organs has well-defined roles and responsibilities. So such aspect of separation of powers ensure that a single organ as such does not become dominant. So such separation of powers provide for adequate checks and balances between the three organs. For example, the legislature as such has been empowered to make laws. Executive as such has been empowered to implement the laws made by the legislature. And when it comes to judiciary, the judiciary is required to interpret the law so as to ensure that the laws are in line with the constitutional ideals. So even though we do have separation of powers, at the same time, we must realize that strict compartmentalization or strict separation of powers may not be suitable in certain exceptional circumstances. For example, under certain exceptional circumstances, the executive, that is the president, can formulate ordinances. Similarly, the president also has certain judicial powers. Apart from that, the legislature can also delegate some of its functions to the executive as part of the subordinate legislation. Now, particularly when you look at the ordinance making powers of the executive, that is the president at the central level and the governor at the state level, this ordinance making power is actually an exceptional power which has been vested with the executive in order to deal with certain exceptional circumstances. For example, let's say the legislature is not in session and the government wants to come up with a new law. So in such case, the president at the central level or the governor at the state level can actually promulgate the ordinances to deal with such circumstances. So this ordinance making power, which has been vested with the executive, it's actually an exceptional power. But the problem here is this ordinance making power has frequently been misused. In fact, the ordinance making powers has been misused to an extent that the Supreme Court has said that it is actually a fraud on the Indian Constitution. If you have to understand the extent of misuse, one would have to simply look at the famous Bihar case. So, the Supreme Court had observed that in the state of Bihar, between 1967 to 1981, almost around 256 ordinances were promulgated by the governor. Out of this 256 ordinances, almost around 11 ordinances were kept alive without any kind of legislative scrutiny for more than 10 years. So as you can see, even though we have given the power to executive to deal with certain exceptional circumstances, quite often the ordinance making power has been misused. And now if you look at the latest case in the state of Kerala, the Kerala government has recently sent the Kerala governor, Mr. Arif Muhammad Khan, almost around 11 ordinances for their re-promulgation. Some of these ordinances included the controversial Kerala Lokayukta 1999 Amendment Ordinance and the Kerala Cooperative Societies Act 2022 Amendment Ordinance. So since the Kerala government had asked the Kerala governor to re-promulgate these ordinances without the legislative scrutiny, the Kerala governor, Mr. Arif Muhammad Khan, has taken exception to the state government's move to reissue the ordinances instead of getting them passed by the state legislature. So as far as your UPSC examination is concerned, from the perspective of the prelims examination, one should be aware about the details of the ordinance making powers of the executive. And from the perspective of the mains examination, you must understand about the misuse of the ordinance making powers and the Supreme Court judgments with respect to ordinances. Now coming to various aspects of ordinance making powers, starting with the constitutional provisions. See, Article 123 of the Indian Constitution empowers the President to promulgate the ordinances. On similar line, Article 213 empowers the Governor also to promulgate the ordinances. These ordinances as such would have the same force and effect as an act of parliament, but we must understand that these ordinances as such are in nature of temporary laws. Now with respect to exercise of ordinance making powers by both President and Governor, there are certain important restrictions. Let's look into these restrictions. First and foremost, ordinance can be promulgated only when both the houses or either of the house is not in session. For example, at the central level, an ordinance can be promulgated by the President only when both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha are not in session, and an ordinance can also be promulgated when just one house, for example Lok Sabha, is in session. What is also important to be noted here is an ordinance can also be issued when only one house is in session. Now this is quite important because, as you know, a law can be passed by both the houses and a law cannot be passed by a single house. So that is why even when just one house is in session, even then the President can actually promulgate the ordinances. The President or the Governor can make an ordinance only when he is satisfied that the circumstances exist that render it necessary for him to take immediate action. Which means, in a way, if the President or the Governor is satisfied that there are certain exceptional circumstances that warrant issuance of ordinances, then ordinance can be issued by the President or the Governor. And obviously, such ordinances are issued based upon the recommendations given by the concerned government, which means for the President, it is a center, and for the Governor, it is a state government. Third aspect here is the ordinance making power of the President and the Governor is co-extensive on all the matters which the Parliament at the central level and the state legislature at the state level can make the laws. So on whatever subjects the Parliament can make laws, on all of these subjects the President can promulgate the ordinances. Similarly, on whatever subjects the state legislature can make laws, on those subjects the Governor can promulgate the ordinances. But there is one difference here. The difference is with respect to duration. So unlike the laws which are passed by the Parliament or the state legislature, these laws as such are permanent unless they are amended by the concerned legislature. But when it comes to the ordinances are in more nature of the temporary laws. The next aspect is with respect to the duration of ordinances. Whatever ordinances are issued by the President or the Governor, such ordinances should be laid down before the legislature when it reassembles, and such ordinances should have to be approved within 6 weeks of the commencement of the next session. So if the ordinance is approved by the legislature, it would become an act. On the other hand, if the legislature rejects the ordinance, then it would no longer be in existence. More importantly, if the ordinance fails to get passed within 6 weeks of the commencement of the next session, then the ordinance would cease to exist. And last and most importantly, as you know, the maximum gap between the two sessions of the parliament cannot be more than 6 months. So ideally, the maximum duration of ordinance can be up to 6 months, 6 weeks. Now coming to the need for having the ordinance making powers in the Indian Constitution. So while justifying the ordinance making power, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar highlighted that such ordinance making powers would enable the executive to deal with certain exceptional circumstances, particularly when the parliament is not in session. Apart from that, necessary safeguards have also been incorporated to ensure that the executive does not misuse the ordinance making powers. For example, the rules of procedure of Lok Sabha provides that whenever the executive or the government presents a bill to replace the ordinance, so while presenting such a bill, the executive should present a statement, and this statement should explain the circumstances behind promulgation of ordinances. So this requirement of the executive to present a statement explaining the reasons behind promulgation of ordinances ensures the accountability of the government towards the parliament. So now coming to the problems and challenges with respect to ordinance making powers. First and foremost, like I discussed before, it violates the principle of separation of powers, which in a way could be a threat to the sovereignty of parliament and the state legislature. The best example of such a thing can be the Bihar case about which I had discussed before. Nextly, see, when you look at democracy, the democracy is all about the 3 Ds, that is debate, discussion and dissent. So when the government takes frequent recourse to the repromulgation of ordinances, then debate, discussion and dissent on the important aspects do not take place inside the parliament. So in a way, it bypasses the democratic requirements of argument and deliberation, which are so critical. And last and most importantly, frequent repromulgation of ordinances defeats the very essence of the Indian Constitution. So here we must realize that the president and governor have a limited power to frame the ordinances. The power of the president and the governor to make laws, we must understand it is not a parallel power of legislation. We are given such a power to the president and the governor to deal with certain exceptional circumstances, but because of the frequent repromulgation, the president and the governor will be exercising parallel powers of legislation, which in turn would hurt the democratic process. So over a period of time, the Supreme Court of India has passed a number of judgments with respect to ordinance making powers. So let's look into these judgments one by one. First and foremost, in a very famous case known as R.C. Cooper versus Union of India case, the Supreme Court of India has ruled that the president's decision to promulgate an ordinance can be challenged on the grounds that immediate action was not required. So like I said, if the president or the governor are of an opinion that there are certain exceptional circumstances that warrant the issuance of the ordinances, this particular decision of the president or the governor could be challenged on the grounds that such immediate action was not required. The second judgment is the A.K. Roy versus Union of India case. In this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that President's ordinance making power is not beyond the scope of judicial review, which means whenever the President passes the ordinances, such ordinances will come under the ambit of the judicial review. The next one is with respect to D.C. Vadva versus State of Bihar. So in this particular case, the Supreme Court observed that the legislative power of the executive to promulgate ordinances has to be used sparingly and only in certain exceptional circumstances. Exercise of ordinance making powers cannot be a substitute to the law making power by the legislature. Last and most importantly is the Krishna Kumar Singh versus State of Bihar case. So in this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that if the government does not place the ordinance before the legislature when it commences the next session, This failure of the government to place an ordinance will constitute an abuse of power and a fraud of the Indian Constitution. So going forward, we must understand that the ordinance making powers is indeed needed to deal with exceptional circumstances, but at the same time, the executive should ensure that it does not misuse its ordinance making powers. So here, the executive must exercise self-restraint and it should use ordinance making power sparingly and as per the spirit of the Indian Constitution. Ordinance making power should not be used for subverting the constitutional ideals of principle of separation of powers. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know as far as this particular article is concerned. The next article appears on page number 8. The article is titled as Chellanam's new Tetrapod based seawall. See, Chellanam is basically a village situated in the Ernakulam district of Kerala. This particular village has lost huge amount of land due to coastal erosion. Hence, in order to prevent the coastal erosion in this particular village, the Kerala government has used a new method known as Tetrapod based seawall. So as you can see, the government has constructed this kind of man-made structures in order to prevent the coastal erosion. Now this is what this particular article basically talks about. But from the perspective of the UPSC mains examination, one should be aware about various aspects of coastal erosion. That is, what is coastal erosion? What is the extent of coastal erosion? Why does it take place? What is its impact? And what can be done to prevent the coastal erosion? So let us first start with the meaning of coastal erosion. See, coastal erosion basically means loss of coastal lands, and this takes place due to the net removal of sediments or bedrock from the shoreline. So let's understand this. Now let's say you have a shoreline which is actually separating land from water. Now with respect to this shoreline, as you can see, frequently there is the deposition of sediments such as sand on the shoreline, and this is also accompanied by removal of sediments including sand from the shoreline. So let's say this rate of removal of sediments from the shoreline is much higher than the rate of deposition of sediments on the shoreline. Then this particular shoreline starts moving inward, that is, it starts moving towards the land. So this itself is referred to as the coastal erosion. According to the status report on coastal protection and development in India, which was published in the year 2016, almost around 45% of the total coastline in India is under erosion. Indian coast as such has lost a net area of 73 square kilometer between 1990s to 2004-06 due to coastal erosion. Highest percentage of the shoreline which is under erosion is in Nicobar Islands. And as you can see here, almost around 88% of the coastal land in Nicobar Island has come under coastal erosion. Now with respect to what are the causes of the coastal erosion, so broadly the causes can be categorized into the natural causes and the man-made causes. So overall, if you see, the main cause here is the removal of sediments or the sand is much higher than the deposits of the sediments. And broadly here, the natural causes which can contribute to a much higher removal than the deposition could be the strong wave action, sudden events like tsunami, cyclones, heavy monsoons, sea level increase due to global warming, high tides, and so on. And when it comes to man-made causes, the man-made causes could be a large-scale removal of sand from the beaches for the purpose of construction, reduction of sediment supply due to damming of rivers, unplanned reclamation of land, and more importantly, removal of the mangrove vegetation. Now with respect to mangrove vegetation, I hope you must be knowing that the mangrove vegetation binds the soil strongly and it prevents the erosion. So when large-scale deforestation of the mangrove vegetation takes place, this can also lead to the coastal erosion. Now with respect to the impact of coastal erosion, its impact can be observed in terms of ecological impact, geomorphic impact, economic impact and social impact. With respect to ecological impact, obviously, it leads to destruction of wetlands along with the loss of associated biodiversity. With respect to geomorphic impact, it can lead to the alteration and formation of coastal landforms. For example, if you observe this shoreline starts moving inward because of coastal erosion, and this can also lead to the formation of vertical cliffs. And with respect to economic impact, large-scale coastal erosion can lead to loss of productive land. It can also lead to damage to property, infrastructure, and so on. And more importantly, it adversely affects the fishing, aquaculture, and maritime navigation. With respect to social impact, it adversely affects the livelihood opportunities of the fishermen, leading to their forced displacement. Now, question is, what measures can be adopted in order to prevent the coastal erosion? The first measure is with respect to artificial beach nourishment through adding sand. So this artificial beach nourishment has been shown in this particular figure here. As you can see, you have before and after image here. So here, particularly in the after image, and as you can see here, since we have added more amount of sand to the beach, the deposition of the sediments is much higher than the removal. So this in turn would help us prevent the coastal erosion. The next one is with respect to construction of seawalls. So as you can see, these seawalls as such, they are constructed parallel to the coastline, and these seawalls break the natural flow of the water, which in turn will help us to prevent the coastal erosion. The next one is with respect to mangrove vegetation, which can help us bind the soil and prevent the coastal erosion. And the next one is with respect to construction of griots. So as you can see, when we construct the seawalls are constructed parallel to the shoreline. But when you see the griots here, these griots are constructed perpendicular to the shoreline. So when they are constructed perpendicular to the shoreline, this in turn helps us to break down the overall speed of the waves. And since the speed of the waves get broken down, this results in a much higher deposition of sediments in comparison to the removal, and thus it will help us in prevention of coastal erosion. So broadly, we have different methods for undertaking the preventive measures for the coastal erosion, which is artificial beach nourishment, construction of seawalls, plantation of mangrove vegetation, grants or spurs to interrupt the water flow, and so on. To this, you can even add the tetrapod based seawall. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know as far as this particular article is concerned. The next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Consumer Confidence Falls Again. So this particular article talks about the RBI's Consumer Confidence Survey for July 2022. Now, why is this article important? Please have a look at the question asked in Prelims 2022. The question was, in India, which of the following compiles information on industrial disputes, closures, retrenchments, and layoffs in the factories employing the workers? And the right answer to this particular question was Labor Bureau. So based upon the nature of questions asked in previous year prelims, one must have a basic understanding about the consumer confidence survey. See, when you look at the Indian economy, in the Indian economy, the consumption expenditure alone account for 55 to 60% of India's GDP. So in a way, it is a consumption expenditure which is in turn driving India's GDP. Now, when you look at the consumption expenditure as such, this consumption expenditure in turn depends upon the consumer confidence. That is, to what extent the consumers are confident about the Indian economy. If the consumers have optimism related to Indian economy, that the economy would grow faster, that the GDP would grow faster, then this optimism will turn into higher consumption expenditure, because then the people will feel that the income level will increase because of increase in GDP. So as the consumption expenditure increases, obviously the GDP growth rate will also increase. On the other hand, let's say the consumers are quite pessimistic about the future growth of the Indian economy. So when they are pessimistic about the future growth, then the consumers would feel that their income levels may not increase in future, and accordingly the consumers will then try to curtail their consumption expenditure, and if there is a decrease in the consumption expenditure, there would be a fall in the GDP growth rate. So in a way, if the consumers are optimistic about the future growth of the economy, automatically GDP can increase in future. On the other hand, if consumers are pessimistic about the growth of the economy, then it can actually lead to decline in the GDP growth rate. So, in order to measure this consumer confidence about the Indian economy, RBI carries out a survey. So here, what RBI does is, in this survey, the RBI asks the people as to what they feel presently about the Indian economy and what is their perception about the Indian economy 1 year later. So here the RBI asks the people about the current perception and the future perception of the Indian economy on 5 variables, which can include the present economic situation, the level of employment, the price rise, income, and spending. So, based upon these questions which the RBI asks the people, you have two components of the consumer confidence survey. That is the current situation index, that is what do the presently people feel about the Indian economy, and future expectations index, that is what do they feel about the Indian economy 1 year later. So based upon these two indices, the RBI constructs the consumer confidence index. Now with respect to interpretation of this particular index, if this index value is above 100, it means that the consumers have an optimistic perception of the Indian economy. On the other hand, if this index is below 100, it would mean that the consumers have a pessimistic perception of the Indian economy. For example, this is a screenshot of the Consumer Confidence Index for the month of July 2022. As you can see, this in turn has two index, that is the Future Expectation Index, which has been denoted in blue, and the Current Situation Index, which has been highlighted in red. So right now the Future Expectation Index is above 100, which means that the consumers have optimistic perception about the Indian economy 1 year later. On the other hand, the current situation index, even though it has increased since July 2021, it is still below 100, which in a way shows that even now the consumers have a pessimistic perception about the current state of economy. So as far as the prelims examination is concerned, there is no need for you to remember the trends with respect to consumer confidence index. But you have to know the basics of the consumer confidence index. That alone is more than sufficient. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Let us have a look at the question for the day.